In a GDC talk titled The Missing, an attempt at complete cohesion of gameplay and narrative, which is a hell of a mouthful, Swery explains that he believes video games need to achieve unity between their mechanics and their narrative, which really is just him saying ludonarrative dissonance bad and stretching it out for over an hour. But there's a lot of interesting things in this talk, specifically the fact that he believes you should design the gameplay of a given video game before designing the narrative, and then you should write around the gameplay mechanics you've established. And true to what he's saying, apparently they made the entirety of the Missing's levels and gameplay before writing anything, which is, I mean, it's not uncommon for a lot of AAA games, but whereas AAA games are typically defined by their ludonarrative dissonance, The Missing manages to actually live up to its promise.
Hey, this way.
For those of you who aren't already aware, The Missing is a puzzle platformer where you play as JJ. She's on a totally not romantic getaway with her totally gal pal Emily when things get spooky. JJ and Emily are separated by a razor blade wielding monster called the Hair Shrieker. And as JJ attempts to rescue her girlfriend from the strange surreal events taking place on the island, she is struck by lightning and gains the ability to regenerate from any injury. Mechanically, the game is fairly simple. You go around pushing blocks, you go around pulling blocks, sometimes you climb on the blocks, sometimes you do a jump, and if you're feeling particularly daring, you may even throw a rock. Video games have come a long way since Ocarina of Time. The game's central gimmick is that JJ can regenerate from just about any injury, meaning that instead of, for example, dying when you fall on some barbed wire, you just drop your legs. And this allows you to utilize your body parts to solve various puzzles, or to immolate yourself and become a human torch. Now, if at least a few of you are thinking, hang on a minute, that doesn't sound like much fun, that actually sounds kind of horrifying, you'd be right, because The Missing is a horror game through and through, and it is not afraid to be really, really unpleasant. There's a bit of slapstick comedy in watching JJ get thrown into a wall so hard that gravity literally flips. There's a lot less comedy watching her drag herself across the ground now that her bones are broken, unable to move more than a few steps without toppling over, and when she regenerates having to watch her snap her neck back into place with an audible crack. The Missing could very easily have ended up just being a macabre comedy, but the game goes to great lengths to make it feel super unpleasant to play. Kelly Holloway does a really good job making those screams just viscerally unpleasant. But the mechanics are supporting this as well. The Missing does a great deal to make the violence you're suffering have actual weight to it. But in order to really understand what I mean by that, we need to take a quick segue and talk about design in horror games and player disempowerment. Now, if I asked you to define horror games for me, you'd probably struggle. Just about any definition you could come up with excludes a great deal of the genre, and unlike a lot of video game genres, there isn't really a core mechanical conceit to horror. It's very much an aesthetic thing, and game mechanics that support it don't tend to really have an underlying theme. Nonetheless, there is one that a lot of people gravitate towards, and that is the idea of player disempowerment. The idea being that player empowerment is the primary goal of most video games that are essentially just power fantasies, whereas horror games exist in juxtaposition to this. They seek to disempower you, so as to make the game feel tense. Now the thing is, this was true at one point in history, but as horror game design has evolved, I would say that we've largely moved away from the idea of player disempowerment through mechanics toward immersion as the primary goal. Now, immersion's sort of a very abstract term, as if player disempowerment isn't already, but the broad stroke idea is that you want to be immersed in a horror game. You want to feel like you're there, because that's what makes horror games scarier than the horror films. You've probably heard that one before, because you're the one being chased by the monster, not a character. Ooh. The problem, though, is that this has some pretty critical flaws, the most obvious of which being that in a horror film you're invested in characters. You're not afraid of dying, you're afraid of somebody you care about dying. And this is important because whilst in theory a horror game might be scarier because your life is on the line, you know, if you die in the game, you don't die in real life. So unfortunately, the moment you do die in a horror game, you've immediately undercut all that tension you've just built up.
Pathetic.
Now, the way around this, historically, has been to try and add mechanical forms of horror to try and tie player disempowerment into the experience. Ammo management, fixed camera angles, tank controls, these sorts of things all help create tension within the gameplay experience. And in the case of various horror games, usually there's a real consequence to a fail state. Maybe you have limited saves, or you're forced to save at save points that are quite a distance apart, and this helps tie a tangible fear of losing progress to the narrative fear that you're being chased by the monster. The problem, of course, is that modern horror games, by and large, are increasingly afraid of actually disempowering you in any way. If we look at Dead Space, the first real AAA horror game, you see a real terror, not on the player's side, but on the developers. The central gimmick of Dead Space is that the monsters have to be dismembered. If you're just trying to kill them the way you would a typical video game enemy, they're gonna maul you to death. So you would think the most memorable experience many players would have is those first few encounters where you don't know how to handle the necromorphs, and that light bulb moment where you realize, oh shit, I can cut them up. That isn't what actually happens though. Dead Space is absolutely terrified you might struggle even the slightest bit, and the first encounter with a necromorph has cut off their limbs written on the wall and blood. The second encounter has an audio log right next to the necromorph telling you to cut off the limbs, and then you go 5 steps down the fucking hallway and this happens.
Isaac, be careful. Shooting them in the body didn't seem to work. Go for the limbs. Dismember them. That should do the job.
Conserve ammo by dismembering enemy limbs and doing extra damage.
Now you might say, come on Hollow, that's not fair. Dead Space is an action horror game. It's based on Resident Evil 4. Of course it's not scary. I don't buy that as an excuse. But even if we were to accept that as an argument, what about Amnesia: The Dark Descent? It is the progenitor of modern indie horror, and it is in many ways about as pure a horror game as you can get. I mean, you can't even fight back against things, you have to run from them, you have to hide in closets. It's a game all about trying to get you immersed in the terror of being hunted by beasts. A game that also opens with a message literally telling you exactly what you need to do to avoid the monsters, because yet again the developers are terrified that you would spend more than 5 minutes trying to figure it out. Coupled with the fact that unless you turn them off, there are tutorial messages throughout the game letting you know how to handle the monsters. And all of this punctuated by the fact that Amnesia is very forgiving with its fail states. There are checkpoints in the middle of chase sequences, and that just completely undermines all the tension. If your horror game is built around nothing other than whether or not a given monster is terrifying, you haven't actually got any horror left the moment the player dies. But it's hard to really blame developers for doing this because, you know, this is honestly what a lot of gamers want. If we looked at the critical reception of Pathologic 2, we see a game that is willing to try and disempower players, largely be slated for doing so. It's too hard, it's too confusing, it's too obtuse. In the same year that a Resident Evil 2 remake is heralded as a return to the golden age of horror. A Resident Evil 2 remake that removes the fixed camera angles and tank controls of the original, that makes the limited saving system, one of Resident Evil's smartest ideas, into an optional feature of its hard difficulty mode. This is emblematic of modern horror, a shift towards making you feel like you're in scary places and being chased by scary things, but only doing the bare minimum to make the game actually feel disempowering to play, because that's not a good bit of game design. Everything's got to be fun and rewarding, even if it is ostensibly a horror game. There is a puzzle early on in The Missing, where you have to navigate a dark room and burn some vines at the end of it. In order to do this, JJ must ignite herself, and then get to the other side of the room while navigating around some water that would extinguish her. It's a fairly simple premise. The thing is though, whenever JJ is lit on fire, she breaks into a flailing run and starts screaming. It is viscerally unpleasant. This is not a fun puzzle. Listening to JJ screaming non-stop and watching her being literally burnt alive, this is not something I find very fun. Wanting to get this over with as quickly as possible, I make a jump that I shouldn't have. Oh no, I thought I was doing some cool speedrunning shit. No, it turns out that if she's on fire, JJ's legs can't sustain a fall. They break, and as a consequence, she can't get past the water without being extinguished, meaning I have to start the puzzle again. I absolutely do not want to be here. I don't want to be dealing with this. This isn't fun. This isn't enjoyable. This is very actively disgusting. I had to take a break from that puzzle for a bit because I couldn't. And that has never happened to me playing a horror game before. When I came back and I finished the puzzle, I didn't feel good about it. I knew what to do from the start. It wasn't difficult to do. I just felt bad. I felt like I had stuff stuck to my skin. And that's sort of true with the whole of The Missing. Its puzzles and platforming are so simplistic that there's no real sense of accomplishment when you get over them. And the game is slow paced, so the whole thing feels monotonous when things aren't actively unpleasant. This is punctuated with humorous bits of narrative that help keep it becoming too depressing, but the gameplay experience isn't fun, it's not enjoyable. And that is really the key to why The Missing is so effective. The game uses its horror to actively really be horrifying. It's not interested in fleeting scares. It's not interested in your reaction videos and your let's plays. It's interested in actively making you feel gross. It uses body horror with an intent you just don't see in horror games. Not really, even in the old days, let alone today. And that, to me, is really what defines The Missing. When put alongside so many horror games that are desperate to make sure you're having such a good time from the beginning of the game in case you get alienated, The Missing is willing to make sure you're actively having a bad time because that's what it wants you to feel. This is a game about a girl being subject to horrific agony again and again. You're gonna feel that. And the game uses its aesthetics, it uses the weight in its mechanics and its animations. It uses all of that together to really sell you on this. And all of this is absolutely essential to the game's story because it is intimately tied into those emotions. As JJ is being ripped up over and over again, you're gradually learning more about her through the backstory, which is unlocked through text messages that are sort of divided into two halves. There's one set of optional text messages that fill out JJ's relationships with other characters. These are picked up via acquiring the donuts in the environment throughout the levels. And then there's the texts with both her mother and Emily that come just through progressing the story to certain points, and these obviously contextualize her relationship with the both of those characters, but also feed us the actual specific plot points that led up to JJ coming to the island in the first place. Through these texts, we learn that she's a product design student who has a fondness for antiques and wishes to design retro things. We learn that she works herself too hard and that she constantly makes an effort to help her friends with their work. We learn she has a sweet tooth and that she lacks confidence in herself and that she wants to learn to cook and that she wants to travel, and bit by bit we can see this funny, kind character beginning to develop. And the more you begin to learn about JJ and her relationships with other characters, the more the graphic violence she's subject to gets all the worse. In a lot of horror games, the plot is either just there to justify the game, or it tries to do its own thing that, even if it manages to be effective, often isn't really connected to what you're doing in the gameplay. In The Missing, the narrative serves to elevate the gameplay, because while it's bad enough when JJ is a largely uncharacterized player stand-in, as you begin to empathize with her more and more, and she's realized into a believable person you could probably be friends with or maybe relate to, the game just keeps getting more unpleasant. And the game hasn't even played its hand yet, because bit by bit we begin to realize that there's more going on with JJ, that her lack of self-confidence, that the secrets she shares with Emily, that her admiration for Abby and her tension with her mother's prejudice, they all start to paint a picture. And as you connect those dots and maybe figure out what's going on, it's made explicit when JJ's mom finds women's clothing in JJ's bedroom and then proceeds to go through her diary. JJ is trans. Her mother, being a prejudiced religious parent, takes JJ to see a psychologist and looks into getting her conversion therapy. Meanwhile, she gets outed to one of her friends who proceeds to out her to the rest of the school, and between the ensuing bullying that occurs, her increasingly stressed relationship with her mother, her dysphoria, and just the mounting pressures of being a trans adolescent, JJ attempts suicide. On the island, as JJ finds Emily's body at the peak of the clock tower, we see JJ's last note to Emily and her mom. And then FK and JJ have a text exchange that looks like this. If you are trans, you've probably had this conversation before. The specific wording is different, obviously, but most of us have had to explain ourselves, justify ourselves in exactly this sort of way to people. And doing so isn't easy because most cis people simply don't have a reference for understanding those sorts of experiences. You're asking them to understand something that is, as far as they're concerned, incredibly abstract. It's not uncommon to ground that experience in some sort of metaphor so that people can actually relate to it. That is what The Missing has been doing since the game started. Piece by piece, The Missing has engineered this sense of empathy for JJ and the awful physical agony that she's going through, and then it recontextualizes that experience and says, this is what it's like to be trans in a hostile world. This is what it's like to try to be yourself against so many pressures, both external and internal, that are trying to keep you from doing that. The Missing's central mechanic is that JJ has to mutilate herself again and again in order to progress. Transphobes often refer to transition as mutilation. The game turns that on its head. JJ has to mutilate herself to progress. She's given agency, there is choice here, but the game demonstrates to you that, it's not really a choice. It asks you to do this and to understand that this is necessary. This is something that you have to go through, even if it's hard, even if it's sometimes unpleasant. The Missing uses its mechanics to contextualize JJ's experience of being trans, and it uses JJ's transness to in turn recontextualize the gameplay. Neither of these things in a vacuum would be remotely as effective, but together the unison is what makes the game so impactful. Back on the island, JJ ends up in the school once again, and we gradually see the events that led up to everything playing out in the background as bit by bit we transition from the JJ we've been playing as into the Hair Shrieker, now gargantuan, and then having finally caught up to Emily, we consume her. This is the part where the game's less on-the-nose metaphors get a bit confusing, but it's worth noting that the Hair Shrieker carries a razor blade, the same thing that JJ used to attempt suicide in the real world, and that Emily, in the context of the story, refers to herself in the first person as JJ. Emily is a stand-in for JJ's self-acceptance. And the Hair Shrieker represents a combination of all her suicidal feelings and dysphoria. The JJ we have been playing as up until this point is JJ when she's femme presenting. So with all three of these JJs now whole, JJ, the person, finally realizes that she has died, that this whole dreamlike sequence on the island is just sort of her last experience, and in a conversation with FK, she's about ready to make peace with that when FK puts his foot down and basically says, no, you've got reasons to live, you need to stand up. FK, that small, battered, broken piece of self-love that still remains at JJ's core. She hasn't given up yet. She chooses to stand up. And it's worth noting in this case that Emily is one of the main reasons she still has to live, which is why JJ's self-acceptance is portrayed as Emily in the story and why we're chasing after her. This leads us into the game's ending sequence where JJ stands up, now separate again from the Hair Shrieker, and engages in a triumphant final scene where the music becomes upbeat, our regenerative powers become instantaneous, and we use them to take a lightning rod at the very thing that gave us the power to regenerate and proceed to shove it through the Hair Shrieker's chest. A trans girl takes the literal means of her transition and uses it to slay the physical embodiment of her dysphoria. That's a pretty fucking metal trans narrative. And so, having accepted herself, JJ survives her attempt, and we get an ending sequence that provides us some closure. What a fucking game, holy shit. It's probably at this stage that we really need to talk about trans representation in media. You see, cis people tend to write trans characters in very specific ways. If we're lucky, they're sort of flat characters, token representation for creators to demonstrate how woke they are, literal virtue signaling. If we aren't lucky, they are either punchlines to be laughed at, they're fucking tragedy porn. It's, oh, this poor pitiful trans girl, isn't it tragic that she's like this? Or we're serial killers in horror movies, because of course we are. The Missing could easily have gone in any of these directions. It especially could have been tragedy porn. The game could have simply ended with JJ dying. They could have put up a suicide hotline number on the screen. Everyone would be shaking Sweary's hand and commiserating him on how fucking brave and compassionate he was to write something like that. And that's not what he did. Instead, he gave us one of the most thoughtful, heartfelt, and honest trans stories that I've personally ever experienced.
I was worried
And
to death.
that is not easy to do. He did that while also creating a video game that manages to contextualize a trans narrative in the context of its mechanics, which is fucking surreal. I mean, if you go back to The Missing on New Game Plus, you unlock cheats, and these cheats, they do things like letting you run faster, they let you regenerate instantly. It completely recontextualizes the whole gameplay experience. It's like, the weight has been lifted off your shoulders, and like, that's coming out. That's the experience of actually transitioning. Like, this game, it's fucking unlockable cheats fit into the whole of that story, and that's amazing.
Striking. But where? If I use
Horror
that,
as a genre, despite offering so much room to empathize with and humanize outsider perspectives, so often just victimizes and demonizes people who are just trying to live our lives. And The Missing uses horror instead as a way to humanize a trans character. It uses player disempowerment to make the experience throughout the game feel authentic, and in turn that means that that final empowering sequence actually feels earned and justified in a way that it would not had the game simply being fun and enjoyable to play all throughout. The Missing earns its happy ending in a way that very few video games honestly manage to. As a fan of horror games, The Missing stands out to me because it uses its violence and its body horror in service of a real theme. It's not just scary without end, it has a genuine point. And as a trans girl, the game is important to me for obvious reasons. In his GDC talk, The Missing, an attempt at complete cohesion of gameplay and narrative, which is still as much of a mouthful as the first time, Swery says, "I believe the more a game's story is strongly fused with its gameplay, the more it will move its players." I think The Missing is a phenomenal illustration that he's right.
So tell me the reason we're here, the reason we're living. Show me a way to understand all the things that I'm feeling. Take me down those old cobbled streets where we